On the night of February 1st, 1959, 9 hikers were camped on a remote mountain slope in the northern Ural Mountains of Soviet Russia. They were young, they were experienced. They were less than 10 miles from their destination. Sometime during the night, something happened. They slashed open their tent from the inside. They ran out into negative 40-degree temperatures. Some were barefoot. Some were in their underwear. They ran more than a mile downhill through deep snow in total darkness, and not a single one of them survived. When investigators finally reached the scene weeks later, what they found made no sense. Some had frozen to death. Others had injuries so severe they were compared to a car crash, but had no external wounds. One woman was missing her tongue. The Soviet government concluded the hikers had been killed by an unknown compelling force. The case was sealed for decades, and 67 years later, no one knows what really happened on that mountain. In January 1959, a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov assembled a group of 9 others for a skiing expedition through the northern Ural Mountains. Most were students or recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsk, the city now known as Yekaterinburg. There were 8 men and 2 women. The youngest was 20. The oldest, Semyon Zolotaryov, was 38. A World War II veteran and the only non-student in the group. This was not a casual trip. The route was classified as Category 3, the most difficult rating in the Soviet system. The goal was to reach Otorten, a mountain deep in the wilderness. Every member of the group was an experienced hiker. Igor Dyatlov had led expeditions before. These were not amateurs. They knew what they were doing. The group left Sverdlovsk on January 23rd. They traveled by train to the town of Ivdel, then by truck to Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement before the wilderness. From there, they set out on skis into the frozen backcountry. One member of the group, Yuri Yudin, fell ill on January 28th and turned back. It was the luckiest illness of his life. He was the only one who would survive. The remaining 9 continued north, pushing through heavy snow and bitter cold. Their journals and cameras would later be recovered. They documented the trip with photographs and diary entries. Everything appeared normal. There was no sign of conflict, no hint of danger. Just 9 young people on a difficult but well-planned expedition. On February 1st, the group reached the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, a mountain whose name, in the indigenous Mansi language, translates to Dead Mountain. They set up camp on the exposed slope, rather than descending to the tree line below, where they would have had more shelter. Dyatlov's likely reason was to avoid losing the elevation they had gained. The plan was to summit Otorten the following day. They pitched their tent, had dinner, and settled in for the night. The temperature outside was dropping toward negative 30 degrees Celsius. The wind was howling across the barren slope. What happened next has haunted investigators for 67 years. On February 26th, search teams finally located the group's tent on the mountainside. What they found made no sense. The tent was half collapsed and covered in snow. It had been slashed open from the inside, not the entrance but the side wall, cut with knives from within. Every pair of boots had been left behind. Most of the group's warm clothing was still inside. Backpacks, supplies, everything they would have needed to survive had been abandoned. 9 sets of footprints led away from the tent, heading downhill toward the tree line, nearly a mile and a half away. Some prints were from bare feet, some from socks, some from a single shoe. The tracks were orderly at first, walking in a group. Then they spread apart, and then the snow covered them completely. At the edge of the forest, about a mile and a half from the tent, searchers found the remains of a small fire beneath a large Siberian pine, and there, lying in the snow in nothing but their underwear, were the first 2 bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, both 21 and 23 years old. They had frozen to death. The branches on the pine tree were broken up to 5 meters high, suggesting one of them had climbed it, perhaps trying to see the tent or look for the others. Their hands were torn and scraped. They had tried to break branches for fire. They had tried to survive. But in those temperatures, without clothing, they had no chance. Between the pine tree and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin. They were found at distances of 300, 480, and 630 meters from the tree, spaced along the slope as if they had been trying to walk back to the tent. Their positions suggested they had died mid-stride, fighting their way uphill through the snow. Dyatlov was found lying on his back, one arm wrapped around a small birch tree. Kolmogorova was face down in the snow. Slobodin was found with a small crack in his skull. Not enough to kill him, but unexplained. All 3 had died of hypothermia. They had been trying to get back. They never made it. The remaining 4 hikers were not found until May 4th, more than 3 months later. They were buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine, 75 meters deeper into the forest from the pine tree. And the condition of their bodies changed everything investigators thought they knew about this case. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old, had massive chest fractures. Her ribs crushed inward with a force the medical examiner compared to a car crash. Semyon Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old veteran, had identical chest injuries. Nikolai Thibault Brignol had catastrophic skull damage. The 4th, Alexander Kolovatov, had died of hypothermia. But here is what made these injuries so disturbing. There were no external wounds, no cuts, no bruises, no signs of impact on the skin. The bones were shattered from the inside, as if an enormous pressure had been applied evenly across their bodies. All 4 bodies found in the ravine showed severe soft tissue damage to their faces. Zolotaryov was missing both of his eyes. Kolovatov was missing his eyebrows. And Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and facial tissue. The forensic examiner concluded this damage was likely post-mortem, caused by decomposition and the running water in the stream where the bodies lay. But that explanation satisfied almost no one, because the injuries to Dubinina's chest, the ones that killed her, remained completely unexplained. What force could crush a person's ribs without leaving a single mark on the outside of the body? The medical examiner had no answer. The Soviet investigation was swift, confused, and ultimately abandoned. Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator, noted several things he could not explain. Some of the hikers' clothing showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination. Witnesses in the area reported seeing strange orange spheres in the sky on the night of the incident. Ivanov initially suspected military involvement, but was told to close the case. In May 1959, the investigation was officially terminated. The final conclusion stated that the hikers had been killed by an unknown compelling natural force. The case files were sealed. The area around Kholat Syakhl was closed to hikers for 3 years, and no one was ever held responsible. In the 67 years since, dozens of theories have been proposed. An avalanche, but the slope was not steep enough, and the footprints were undisturbed. A military weapons test. Some hikers' clothing tested positive for radiation, and witnesses saw orange lights in the sky. Infrasound from wind vortices, which can cause panic and disorientation. An attack by the indigenous Mansi people, but there was no evidence of any outside presence. A secret meeting gone wrong. Zolotaryov, the oldest member, may have had ties to Soviet intelligence. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation. In 2020, they announced their official conclusion. An avalanche had caused the group to flee in panic. A study by Swiss researchers in 2021 supported this, suggesting a delayed slab avalanche could explain the chest injuries. But many investigators, including the original case lead, disagreed. An avalanche does not explain the radiation. It does not explain the lights. And it does not explain why 9 experienced hikers would slash open a tent and run barefoot into certain death. There was one survivor, Yuri Yudin, the young man who had turned back on January 28th because of illness. He was the last person outside the group to see them alive. For the rest of his life, Yudin was haunted by what happened to his friends. He helped identify their belongings when the bodies were found. He noticed items that did not belong to anyone in the group, including military-style cloth wrappings. In interviews, Yudin said he believed the truth had been covered up. If I had a chance to ask God just one question, he said in 2008 it would be, what really happened to my friends that night? Yuri Yudin died on April 27, 2013. He was 75 years old. He never got his answer. 9 people walked up that mountain. Not one came back. They slashed their way out of a tent. They ran into the darkness. They froze. They fell. Some of them were broken apart by a force no one has ever identified. The Soviet Union called it a compelling natural force and buried the case. Russia reopened it 60 years later and called it an avalanche. And still, after all the investigations, all the theories, all the years, no one can explain why they ran. What could make 9 experienced hikers abandon everything, their boots, their coats, their only shelter, and flee barefoot into negative 40 degrees? Whatever it was, it killed all of them. And whatever it was, it's still up there. If you want more cases like this, subscribe to Cold Vault.